Today we are sitting at my kitchen table, and that is because we are thinking about essentials. We're all in lockdown at the moment, experiencing this lockdown. In fact, I read this week online, so it must be true, that something like 1/4 of the world's population are currently in lockdown of some form or another. And that means for lots of us, we are thinking about essentials. What are the things that are essential for life? The things that are going to sustain us through the next weeks and maybe even months. And I think we've all seen people making a grab for those things that they consider to be essentials, and they don't care whether anyone else gets hold of them or not, as long as they've got them and they're okay. Things like toilet rolls. This is my emergency toilet roll. Haven't quite had to break into it yet, but I've got it just in case. Things like soap. It's been so difficult for people to be able to find soap in the last few weeks. It's crazy. Things like pasta. Pasta has become a rare commodity in the last few weeks. And maybe even things like rice. This is my rice jar at the moment. It's not looking very healthy, so please send me more rice. I need more rice. These are some of the things that people think of as essentials. We also have our mobile devices, things that keep us connected. These have become more and more essential in the last couple of weeks. We have to find new and creative ways of being together, even while we're far apart. Although, let's not forget people who struggle with this modern technology, people who maybe can't afford a mobile phone, a smartphone, people who struggle to use the technologies. Give them a phone call. Let them know that they are cared for and loved and thought about. Let them hear your voice. I think though we have also been thinking about what are the spiritual essentials. And that's what we're talking about today, spiritual essentials. The spiritual essentials for life, not just in a time of crisis, but actually any time. Today's story is a story that's all about essentials, and it begins earlier in John chapter 6, when Jesus is dealing with one of our most basic needs, hunger. John 6 is set in Galilee. Jesus is among his own people, and crowds of people are starting to be drawn to Jesus because of the miracles and the healings that he's been performing. And at the beginning of the chapter, there's this massive crowd coming around Jesus, and Jesus realizes that everyone is hungry. And so he turns round to one of his disciples, to Philip, and he says, "We need to find bread for all these people." And Philip says, "Don't be daft. Don't be daft. We can't get enough food for these people, and there are good reasons. We don't have enough money to buy food. There's too many people. It just isn't practical. We don't have the resources to deal with this number of people." Philip isn't being negative. He isn't being obstructive. Philip is being really down to earth. There are simply too many people to feed them. Send them home. That would be the practical thing to do. And imagine then what Philip and the other disciples and the crowd started to think when Jesus says, "It's fine. I've got this." And a little boy has offered Jesus 5 loaves and 2 fish. There are 2 fish in this tin of sardines. And Jesus says, that'll be enough. And the people start to divide up the bread and to share out the fish, and they're munching away, but it never seems to run out. 5 rolls and a tin of sardines, and everyone is getting enough. Not just a crumb, but plenty to eat. So much so that there's food left over. Imagine if you had been there. Imagine if you were in the crowd. You couldn't fail to realise that you had experienced a miracle, something out of the ordinary, something that couldn't be explained by human reasoning or human understanding? What would you do if you were part of that crowd who had had that experience? Maybe some of us would rush home. Maybe we want to tell our friends and family all about what we've experienced. And possibly some of the crowd would have done that. But I think quite a lot of us would do what the crowd did, which is hang around. Let's see what's going to happen next. We've seen one good miracle. Chances are we might see another one. This could be a good show. This could be worth staying around for. And if this guy really is as powerful as he seems to be, well, let's make him into a king. That's what John tells us that the people wanted to do with Jesus. And in the middle of all of this, Jesus and his disciples slip away. And the crowds have no idea where they've gone. We know, of course, that there's then this whole miracle of Jesus walking on the water through the storm to the disciples that we thought about last week. But the crowds don't know this. And so we come to today's story. It's the day after this big feeding miracle. And lots of people have stayed around. They've experienced what John calls a sign, a miracle. And they don't want to leave it at that. There's a sense of what else will Jesus do? There's a real vibe of expectation running through the crowd. But when they wake up, there's no sign of Jesus or his disciples. And there's a real sense of annoyance from the crowd. How dare this guy disappear on us? He belongs to us. We want to know where he is and what he's doing. And so they set out to find him, and eventually they catch up with him. And John tells us when they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" You get the idea that the crowd are really quite indignant, searching for Jesus after he disappeared. And the question they're really asking is, how did you get here without us knowing? What's happened? The thing is though, the actions of the crowd make me want to ask some questions. Why were this crowd so keen to find Jesus? What were they looking for from him? And maybe these are questions that actually we need to ask ourselves. Because you see, at the beginning of John chapter 6 and verse 2, John tells us a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs that he had performed on the sick. They had seen what Jesus did, they had seen his power, they had experienced a miracle for themselves when they ate the bread. When they went in search of Jesus, it wasn't because they wanted to know more about him or to know him. It was because of their full stomachs, and Jesus knew their motives. Jesus says, "I tell you the truth, you're looking for me, not because you saw the miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." So you might remember last year when we looked at some of John's gospel, I told you that there are times in John when Jesus uses really strong words, and it's usually translated as "I tell you the truth." But what it literally says is "Amen, amen," always double amen in John. It's a shout, it's an emphasis. It says this stuff matters. It's Jesus banging his fist. And we find it here again in verse 26. Amen, amen. You are looking for me because you ate and had your fill. It's all about what they can get from Jesus and not about Jesus himself. I wonder what brings us to Jesus. What do we expect from him? When we looked at this story last year, I shared some words from a writer that I really like, a guy called Paul Louis Metzger, and I think it's worth sharing again. He says, "The crowds are following Jesus around in search of an endless supply of free happy meals. They're not seeking him as an end in himself, but as a means to an end, filling their guts with free bread served fast. They want more and more free food, calling out, 'Supersize me.'" Does that attitude sound familiar? Faith like that is like that of a little child after a happy meal. Feed me. Give me the shiny toy. I'll stick with you as long as I'm entertained, as long as I feel good, as long as my needs have been met. That's the essentials for the crowd. And there is so much me in this attitude. In much the same way as the stockpiling we're seeing at the moment in this COVID-19 crisis is an utterly selfish response to what's going on. So the attitude that wants Jesus' blessings and miracles without really wanting to know Jesus and to love him is also a really selfish response. Now don't get me wrong, I know that knowing Jesus involves blessing. It involves things that make us feel good, for sure. But that is not the reason to know Jesus. The reason to know Jesus is that he is God and that he reaches out to us in love. And very often, people whose faith in Jesus depends on the kind of feel-good, happy meal stuff, the fun toys, very often these people struggle when things get hard. And that's why we need to not just think about essentials, but know our essentials. What do we need to sustain us? Does a happy meal and a toy sustain us spiritually? No, of course it doesn't. And that's why the key verse that I want us to think about and focus on today is verse 35. Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." The thing that Jesus is really challenging the crowd about is that what matters is not what Jesus can do for you, but who Jesus is. You're thinking about bread, says Jesus. You're thinking about what fills your stomach and maybe makes a good story about seeing a miracle. Okay then, let me tell you about the bread that matters.